Now let's assume that at this point you're familiar with my ideas about definition of addiction and the importance of it and the details of it, my effort to deconstruct some of the existing frameworks for defining and understanding addiction, and my scheme, my framework for putting the pieces together. So let's recap. Disease or choice, stated in a manner to imply that there's a complete explanation contained within those four words. Addiction is a disease, addiction is a choice. I take complete issue with that. That's far from a complete explanation on either side of that. And I don't think it's really a matter of those two being mutually exclusive or incompatible. And yet I disagree with both of them, and I offer a third alternative. And that quite as simply is that addiction in all its manifestations is a matter of volitional behavior, motivated behavior. And depending on levels of awareness, that behavior looks one way or another. For instance, the cravings and the compulsivity, the dependency, the withdrawal, they clearly have a bodily, brain, neurochemical, physiological element to them that, like hunger pangs, produces a leaning in terms of preferences and choices and choice and the perception of options. I'm really hungry and I won't survive if I don't eat. It kind of limits the options that I can consider choosing in the moment or in the very near future. If I believe I'm really hungry, even if I'm not physiologically hungry, I'm still going to make the same choices. In other words, how the brain component or how the mind component factors in to the execution of volitional behavior by the person depends on the motivational set. And due to my extensive studying of the emotional basis of motivation as described in my book, The Physics of Emotioning, I believe I can definitively say, from my perspective, that all of addiction is a matter of willed volitional behavior, motivated volitional behavior, occurring in varying levels of awareness or conscious awareness. If I to give you an example, when I was quitting smoking about 30 years ago, I was feeling a lot of cravings, a lot of perceived need to have a cigarette, and I was fighting it successfully, quote unquote. But the battle was taking its toll on me. I was very frustrated and angry and irritable and depressed, and not sure I could follow through with it, given all that physiological and psychological withdrawal experience. I went to bed one night early on and had a dream that I was smoking a cigarette that was the size of a telephone pole. And at one end of this giant cigarette was a giant filter. I did smoke filtered cigarettes when I smoked. And at the other end there were several people with torches trying to light the big fat end of the telephone pole size cigarette. So that kind of gives you an example of what I'm talking about. My body and its cravings, some of which I'm sure was a contribution of the nicotine dependence, but some of which I'm clear was the psychological dependence, the emotional dependence. And together, even while I'm sleeping, they form this image of my tremendous need. Inside the dream, I remember at the time that I kind of stuck my whole head into the filter and had the experience of filling up my entire lungs with smoke. So it speaks to the cravings, the dependencies, as, you know, potentially part physiochemical and potentially part psychological, the mix of which would never really be fully decipherable, as they sort of gather into this drive that I perceive is pushing from the inside, triggering me perhaps from the outside, and making my choices seem pretty limited. I managed to stop smoking because I kept choosing the suffering, if you will, one way to look at this. I kept choosing the suffering that went with overriding the drive to cave into that very powerful impulse to smoke. And you could say I did it from sheer willpower, but the truth is, I did it as a function of, yes, I was committed to winning this fight inside. And B, I used any and every tactic I could think of. I think at one point I actually, you know, was trying the little rubber band that you snap. I did not get the staple in the ear thing, and this was well before there was Chantix or, you know, any of these other you know, nicotine patch devices available. So it's willed volitional behavior at varying levels of consciousness. I was asleep, and even while I was asleep, the cravings were energizing me. And another example of this is that a lot of addicts will report that they go into a kind of a trance. The craving is powerful, they kind of go into a trance, and so choices seem to get made for them, like they were sleepwalking. So you see the level of awareness is kind of critical. And in fact, I've worked with people who did engage in sleepwalking eating. I didn't find anybody yet that did sleepwalking drinking of alcohol. Although plenty of people use the alcohol to support their battling insomnia. They wake up 3 hours later, they drink more alcohol. But they're aware of what they're doing. So the fact that the body from the psychological realm and from the physiological realm is creating the severe craving does not change the fact that the organism, operating with, again, a varying level of self-conscious and conscious awareness, is engaging in willful behavior, volitional behavior. So it's motivated, it's volitional at all times, regardless of the level of consciousness. And it doesn't really matter then in the end how precisely you parse out the quote-unquote brain or physical neurochemical contribution versus the psychological, the mind, or the emotional contribution to the felt need, to the craving, to the perception of, I mean, they like to talk about this, like my survival depends on it. Like, no, your survival doesn't really depend on it, and people don't actually think that. But they do say and feel things like, the withdrawal's killing me. And so, you know, in terms of terminology, perhaps you could draw that connection to survival. But again, recognizing the either-or debate, whether it's you know, the mind and choosing, or whether it's the brain and the disease, that in the end it has to be both on some level, and we don't need to know the exact contribution from either. And in fact, we should stop insisting that we split those hairs before we proceed, and we should treat withdrawal symptoms and cravings and relapse vulnerabilities as a function of their being motivated volitional behavior based on some bodily experience and based on some mind-based interpretation of that experience. And so we're working with the whole person. We're not splitting them into a brain and a mind. So that's the nutshell, the bottom line of my definition. We get into more details about what I really understand to be choice, and some more details about what I really agree or will concede is a matter of brain dynamics, if you will, brain functions at a later date.